Hi, my name's Ian and welcome to my channel. This particular series is about role-playing games that have shaped our hobby and continue to do so, with so many games on the market and so many older games and editions available in PDF and print-on-demand forms from DriveThruRPG and elsewhere. The hobby can be a confusing place for new and even some veteran players. Here, I'm attempting to dispel some of that confusion by running through the history of each game, giving an overview of its play features, sharing my thoughts on it, and outlining the essentials to pick up if you want to give it a go. Thus far, we have covered Traveller's conception, its initial development, the interregnum, and the renaissance that it is currently enjoying under Mongoose Publishing. But Mongoose's edition, which heralds back to the original classic rules, isn't the only current version, and neither is it part of the main line of the Traveller family tree. That we are covering in today's video, Traveller's 5th edition, affectionately known as T5. After the relative disaster that was Mark Miller's Traveller, or T4, and the whole Imperium Games debacle, see my video on that edition of the game, Traveller was thrown into something of a turmoil. People were obviously still playing the game, and it was still receiving support from the likes of Bits and other companies, and the fact that the publishers involved in the interregnum, the name that I give to the period during which elements of Traveller and its default setting of the Third Imperium were licensed to various companies, producing offshoots such as GURPS Traveller and Traveller 20 and Hero Traveller, and ultimately ending up with Mongoose Traveller that is still with us, in its 2.5 edition. It showed that there was still a market for the game. Throughout the post-T4 interregnum, sporadic hints came through the grapevine and forums such as Citizens of the Imperium that Mark Miller, the game's creator himself, was working on a 5th edition, and we all eagerly awaited news on that. The tidbits of news and rumours eventually coalesced in 2011, when Mark and Far Future Enterprises, the company that he had set up to handle GDW licences and properties, launched a Kickstarter to get Traveller 5, taglined The Ultimate Edition of the game, to print. The Kickstarter was successful, and the huge core rules tome, a total of 656 pages, was delivered to backers a little bit late, but then that's Kickstarter. This book was astounding. Game subjects that had in prior editions been spread over numerous supplements and articles, if they were dealt with at all, were all here. Character generation, world building, vehicles, starships, guns, clones, androids, robots, psionics, cybernetics, creatures and alien species, sophonts, if you will. Creation rules, all in one book. One book, it must be said, that possesses minimal art and probably a necessity to cram all of that in. When my copy arrived, I devoured it. It was, to me, like the original Little Black Books, writ large, and, like 8-year-old me attempting to figure out what the tightly packed text in those Little Black Books was on about, since my understanding of the physics of space didn't extend much further than Star Wars action figures and model starships, I found myself in a backwash of nostalgia. A mixture of bad and good nostalgia. Good in that it reminded me of my 8-year-old self. Bad as I had, by this point in my exploration of role-playing and war games, become used to books that had made some easy form of sense. This book, a glorious testament to the passion that Mark has for his game, is a total mess. And so it was, fans got to work. Over the next few years, the list of errata found, recorded and resolved on Citizens of the Imperium grew. The PDF version of the book received an errated revision, and yet still more issues were discovered. This was a problem. Alongside Traveller 5, happily trundling away with release after release, was Mongoose Traveller, accessible, understandable and reasonably popular. On the other side of the freeway, the strewn wreckage of vehicles left in the wake of T5's car crash caused many people to shy away from it, understandably so. But within those pages was a usable system. You just needed to look for it, And so it was that the game that had been hiding within the monstrous T5 book came out from behind the barricade, taking another Kickstarter to get it there. In April 2019, Mark Miller launched the campaign to bring a totally errated version of T5 into being, splitting the single huge volume into 3 large ones. Characters and combat, starships, and worlds and adventure. After the 3 little black book volumes that had comprised the original game back in 1977. Everything that had been in the original T5 book had been looked at, fixed, revised, and otherwise prodded and poked about with to ensure that with this release, the Traveller version 5.1, we got something that made sense as a game. This inclusion of examples of vehicles, weapons, starships and so on, built using the T5 rules, was something that would have been sorely missing from the original book, and very much helped both in using the system for play and in having something to compare back to when using the maker systems to build things. However, that this set received roughly half of the number of backers as the original T5 volume is somewhat telling. And that really is where the history so far takes us to. A 4th volume in the T5 series, the second survey, was released in 2020, which is essentially a hard copy formatted output from the Traveller Map online utility. Support with Traveller 5 appears to have stalled, and with the last couple of Traveller releases from GDW being a facsimile edition of Classic Traveller and a lost work release for Mega Traveller, Manhunt, that was originally slated to come out in 1990 as part of Digest Group Publications' Mega Traveller works, where Mongoose's edition of Traveller appears to be going from strength to strength. This to-date final instalment of the main Traveller rules branch seems to be living up to its initial tagline, literally the ultimate edition. Traveller 5 has gained itself a reputation in some quarters as being a complex game. That's not necessarily true. It is, in some ways, simpler than its preceding editions, Traveller the New Era and T4. However, it is more complex, or shall we say detailed, than Mongoose Traveller, and its general textbook-esque layout and writing style don't help dispel the illusion of complexity. But I'll try and cut through it. T5 draws upon the higher difficulty means more dice concept introduced in the T4 rules. That is, target numbers for a given role are set by the task at hand, usually the expertise of the character within a given field, and any difficulty involved in performing that task adds to the number of dice rolled. Let's take a simple example. To sneak about undetected is a difficult check made against a character's endurance characteristic and stealth skill. Difficult checks are made by rolling 3 six-sided dice. A character with an endurance of 7 and a stealth of 2 would therefore need to roll 9 or less on 3 six-sided dice to succeed. This is simplified from T4. Gone are the half dice, and instead we are presented with 9 difficulty levels, starting with easy at 1 die and moving up to beyond impossible at 9 dice. Things can get a little complicated when adjustments apply, of which there are 2 general types. Modifiers apply to the target number for a given task, and die modifiers, or DMs, apply to the dice roll made. Also, some modifiers can add additional dice in or take dice away from the pool to be rolled. These adjustments can come from all over the place, but many can be found summarised on the Master Mods tables. Speaking of tables, I'll also quickly mention here one of the advantages of single die mechanics such as Dungeons & Dragons D20 base over multiple die mechanics such as Traveller in pretty much all of its editions is that modifiers to single die mechanics are clear and predictable. For instance, any adjustment to the die roll or to the target required, difficulty class in D&D terms, when using a single 20-sided die adjusts the probability of its success by 5% per digit. A bonus of +2 to the roll means you are 10% more likely to succeed. A bonus of +3 to the target means you are 50% less likely to succeed, and so on. Multiple dice produce facsimiles of bell curves when it comes to probability, so making adjustments to rolls and targets has a less predictable effect. Never fear, Traveller 5 has you covered, with around 10 pages of explanations and tables referencing dice probabilities that may seem a tad nerdy to some, but are actually incredibly useful when pulling modifiers out ad hoc at the game table. Oh, and I'd like to take another moment here to address a review left on DriveThruRPG with respect to T5. The review noted that T5's system can result in buckets of dice being rolled to determine a single task. This is more or less true, but the T5 rules address it within those aforementioned pages on dice mechanics, specifically a section on many dice. You see, probability-wise, the more dice you roll, the more likely you are to receive a result that is the average for that roll. You roll 10 six-sided dice, you are almost guaranteed to receive a net sum of around 35. Many dice exploits this with a number of options for the referee to keep the action of the game flowing without getting bogged down with mountains of dice being thrown around. My personal favourite is snappily titled Many Dice 3.5 Flux, and here you roll flux, I'll come to that in a second, but essentially it's 2 six-sided dice to determine a multiple that is then applied to the number of dice being called for. In this way, a 10 six-sided dice roll can be resolved simply by rolling 2 six-sided dice, maintaining the full spread of possible results and more or less retaining the probability span. Anyway, flux. I may as well get into this now, since I've brought it up. A flux roll ranges from -5 to +5 and is generated by rolling a six-sided dice, then subtracting the roll of a second six-sided dice from that. T5 includes the concept of bad flux, which is where you roll 2 six-sided dice and then subtract the larger from the smaller number, and good flux, which is where instead you subtract the smaller number from the larger. Flux creates a 2 six-sided dice probability spread, but with the addition of being able to influence the spread to better or worse through the order of subtraction of individual die results. Yes, I love die probabilities. Where were we? Yes, so the task resolution is a simple number of dice according to difficulty against a target number largely based upon a character's expertise, most of the time. So let's get into character generation. In summary, which will tell us where those numbers come from. Like most editions of Traveller, T5 characters have 6 basic characteristics. For humans, these are strength, dexterity, endurance, intelligence, education, and social standing. Different sophonts, alien species and so on, possess different characteristics, which is also a common theme in most editions. For example, Vagra possess charisma instead of social standing. In general, and as in other editions of Traveller, when expressed in extended hexadecimal form as a string, these 6 characteristics form a character's universal personality profile, UPP. 2 additional characteristics are also provided, sanity and psionics, which become useful if and when games run into circumstances that they are needed. Characteristics for humans are generated by rolling 2 six-sided dice for each. In this regard, T5 characters have an equivalent in UPP to classic Mega Traveller, T4 and Mongoose Traveller characters. As we've already noted, characteristics form the basis for check target numbers, but some of them also have direct reference. For example, strength indicates the amount a character can carry in terms of burden, effectively encumbrance, before being penalised. Social standing indicates rank within society, and so on. After generating characteristics, a homeworld is selected, which provides some default skills according to the nature of the world selected. From there, a character begins the career process, which isn't too different from any other edition of Traveller. A character can, before entering into a career, put some time into higher education, potentially raising education, acquiring academic degrees or military commissions. From there, it's on to picking a job. 13 careers are presented, and these are of a broad brush. Other careers could be created if so desired, but I have found the 13 to be flexible enough in definition to cover virtually any concept. The fine-tuning comes in the skills selected while following a career and the specialities within a career opted for. Each career is defined on a single sheet. Handy if you have a PDF copy for printing out and distributing to players as aids during character generation. Each career is individually defined, although they are composed of common elements. For example, the scholar career has an entry requirement to begin that is automatic if education is 8 or higher, or otherwise roll 2 six-sided dice against education or training, while a spacer, Space Navy cruise, simply requires a roll against intelligence, and entertainer has different entry requirements for actor, artist, author, dancer, musician and chef specialities. Some careers have specialities, for example, branches in military careers and those previously mentioned for entertainer, that carry different skills, goals and modifiers throughout the character creation process. And this is all reasonably similar to the extended character generation from Classic and Mega Traveller times. A nice addition is the concept of risk and reward. Each career has a set of characteristics that govern roles to determine special effects per turn. For example, the Spacer career lists C1 and C2 and C4 corresponding to strength, dexterity and intelligence. The C numbers refer to a characteristics order within the universal personality profile, thus allowing a shorthand such as C2 to refer to dexterity, agility and grace, the 3 related characteristics that can occupy that second UPP slot, depending on the type of Sophont a character is. For the first 4-year term followed, any one of those listed characteristics can be selected, but in subsequent terms all of them must be chosen before one can be chosen again. For the spacer that chooses strength for the first term, for example, they must choose dexterity and intelligence in any order during their second and third terms before they can choose a strength again. This selection becomes the term's controlling characteristic, or CC for short. Along with the controlling characteristic for the term, the player also chooses a modifier for the term, from -9 to +9. Positive modifiers reflect caution, and negative ones reflect bravery. These are applied to the controlling characteristic for the term's risk roll, which is 2 six-sided dice versus the controlling characteristic plus that modifier. Usually, if the risk roll succeeds, nothing bad happens to the character, but if it fails, something bad does happen. The reward roll is made in a similar way, except that the caution bravery modifier is reversed. So if a character proceeded with caution for this term, applying a positive modifier to the CC to determine risk, then they subtract that modifier from the CC when making their term's reward roll. Caution carries fewer rewards for lower risk, bravery carries greater rewards for higher risk. And in many ways, this risk and reward mechanic is T5's version of Mongoof's life events. Depending on the career chosen, characters roll per term to receive promotions, commissions and missions that collectively produce skill picks. 4 skills per term, rolled on the tables that the term's missions make available, plus bonus skills for receiving commissions and promotions, and additional skills for achieving certain ranks. Different careers follow variations of this rank process. For example, entertainers accumulate fame and scholars attempt to apply for tenures instead of commissions and so on. Once a term has been completed, a roll is made to see if continuation within that career is possible. Again, very similar to other editions of the game. This may result in the character being able to continue, being required to continue, or by ending character generation. This continuation roll can be avoided by opting instead to change careers, where this is possible. But the decision to change must be made in lieu of the continuation roll, not after a failed roll. During the career process, a character's age must also be accounted for, and any aging effects applied. Once the career process has been completed, the character then musters out and gains certain benefits according to rank achieved and the number of terms followed. And that is basically that. The rules do provide further tables and guidelines for filling in details for a character's background, which are useful but not absolutely necessary. Personally, I prefer for them to be used as they prompt putting meat onto the bones of the career path. And if you're using a generation system like Travellers that produces a skeleton history of a character, you may as well do with it as much of the foundational work and building as you can get it to do. If you want to drill down even further, T5 provides data on genetics that can be derived from a character's core characteristics. This can be fun, especially if the possibility of dynastic progress is in the campaign. That is, campaigns that span enough in-game time for characters to have kids that form the next generation of player characters in the progress of the campaign's unfolding story. If cloning is to be a thing within the campaign too, it's essential to complete genetic details for characters that will plug into that. The rules options for all sorts of character types, clones, aliens, but remember, if you're on someone else's planet, you're the alien. Chimeras, effectively interspecies genetic mixtures. Synthetics, mixtures of biology and technology. Imagine Bishop from Aliens in concept. And androids, so font-like robots, and robots proper. Options for cybernetic enhancements are also present. The admixture of options that can create a wide variety of character concept choices. Okay, so we have defined the task system, we know what characteristics and skills do, and we know how characters generate these through the creation process. Well, let's give a bit of an illustration with respect to how all of this fits together. Let's get into combat. Combat itself is largely abstracted, but it can, if you so desire, be mapped out and fought using miniatures on a battle map or similar. For me, I prefer the mind's eye abstraction, and T-Vive enables this by controlling movement and combat ranges using range bands, similar, in fact, to other editions. There is no initiative. Everyone is assumed to be attacking at once, although he who attacks first in a given round does gain some advantage. This is largely down to referee determination. First, we see if we can hit the thing that we want to shoot at. The distance in range band from that thing and the size factor of it are the numbers that we need, and from there we can determine its apparent size. A size 5 object, that is about human size, at range 3 has an apparent size of 2. 5 minus 3. Dead easy. If apparent size is less than 0, it can't be seen. And a target's actions, such as going prone or crouching down, can also affect its apparent size. Range determines difficulty of an attack. At range 3, we will make our attack by rolling 3 six-sided dice. The target number is equal to relevant characteristics, for example dexterity for shooting, plus our general weapon skills, plus our knowledge of the specific weapon type. Say we were shooting a conventional rifle, we would add dexterity to the fighter skill and the slug weapons knowledge to come up with our target number. This value remains the same most of the time, so it's generally calculated ahead of time and recorded on a character's sheet. To it is added the apparent size of the target, which accounts for range in a neat way. Something that looks small due to distance is harder to hit. For example, if our shooter had a dexterity of 7, fighter 2, slug weapon 2, and is shooting at the size 5 target at range 3, then the target number comes to 13. 7 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. If range exceeds skill, then there is a "this is hard" rule that applies, and the additional six-sided dice is thrown into the difficulty dice pool. In our example, in this case, range 3 versus fighter 2, so our 3d6 attack roll for the range now becomes 4d6. The average roll of 4d6 is 14, so the broad odds of making the shot at a target of 13 aren't too bad. The difficulty can also be adjusted, and this applies to most tasks, by being hasty or cautious. Hasty adds 1 dice to the pool and is reflective of rushing things, a snapshot in combat terms. However, a character can attempt multiple snapshots in one round. By being cautious, a character reduces the pool by 1 dice, an aimed shot. Only 1 aimed shot can be made during a round, but it is more likely to hit. If an aimed shot or a snapshot is not attempted, then up to 2 shots can be made in a round, subject of course to weapon fire and so on. Target numbers can be affected by cover and movement, so there are further modifiers to consider if any of the conditions are at play. But that's basically it for figuring out how to hit something from far away. For damage, each weapon has a listed effect. For the sake of this example, let's take something simple, a standard heavy combat rifle of Tech Level 8, or, more snappily, STD HCR 8. This has a maximum range of 4, and has an effect of frag 4 and bullet 2. The effect numbers refer to the number of dice rolled to determine potential damage, and the effect type is used to determine what kind of protection might mitigate it. So here the potential damage is 4d6 for the frag effect, plus 2d6 for the bullet effect. If the target is wearing tech level 8 combat armour, which provides an armour value of 8, that is because armour mitigates both frag and bullet effects, the total damage is 4d8 minus 8. At an average roll, our target is in for 6 points of damage. Because both frag and bullet effects attack strength, dexterity and endurance, or rather C1, C2 and C3 for the description of the damage effects, the target character must assign the damage inflicted in terms of dice, not points, across those characteristics. A characteristic that has been reduced to 0 cannot be reduced further. Additionally, since the damage, 6 points in this case, is greater than half of the target's armour value of 8, if the target has a dexterity of less than 6, then they would be subject to knockdown. The damage might have an effect on the target's own target numbers, meaning he is reduced in effectiveness due to damage. And that's all we know about injuries during a fight. If a combatant is down, or up and undamaged, or up and operating at reduced effectiveness, that's all we know until the fight is over and proper assessment of what has happened can be made. After the battle, the wounded can be examined and the damage that they have received can be translated into injuries received. Where, how severe and how easy to treat. This isn't necessarily tied to the amount of damage received in a fight. A single attack that inflicted a small amount of damage can still result in a severe injury in the wash. Consider this: a bullet that passed through a character cleanly might have little effect on the character's ability to continue to fight, but once examined afterwards, it's discovered that the bullet took a chunk of a major organ with it that might carry some life-changing effects for the wounded individual. The process here is that the referee determines the severity of the wound and the difficulty of diagnosing it properly. Whoever examines the wound has to then cope with the diagnosis difficulty to figure out the wound and determining how difficult it will be to heal. This process is also applied to vehicles and starships and so on. During battle, all the participants really know is that this particular system has stopped working, or that vehicle has been incapacitated, or whatever. After the fight, the reason why a vehicle might have stopped may simply be that a bullet severed an electrical cable, and all that really is needed to get it working again is to splice that cable back together. Or it may be that the bullet shattered the engine block and that Jeep ain't going anywhere, Bo. All of this sounds complicated, but it really isn't. But one thing that makes it seem hard is the organisation of the books. There's a lot of flicking about to find this or that modifier, but once you have all of the numbers that you need set down on a combat sheet, it isn't difficult, and it does add a lot of narrative scope to sit behind the numbers. You lost 5 hit points of damage carries a lot less narrative weight than you have a bullet lodged in your spleen. This kind of task-oriented process carries on into vehicle and starship combat, with target numbers and attack dice being constructed in similar ways. Damage to such equipment isn't recorded as points though. Rather, damage inflicted versus relevant armour and protection goes to determine the operational effect on equipment, and ultimately how easy it is to figure out what is broken and how to fix it at the end of the fight. So what about the rest of the game? Well, T5 is very much a toolkit, and that is reflected in the sheer amount of tools of creation present in the core books. Beyond character generation, we have makers for starships, vehicles, weapons, armour, equipment, creatures and so forth. And also, here is the Traveller world creation system writ large. If you have ever looked at the Traveller Map second survey data with, say, a Mongoose Traveller experience set, and wondered what all of the rest of the strange classification codes and numbers mean, well, they come from T5. Like many perceived complex games, T5 is actually quite simple under the surface, mechanically, but the devil is in the detail, and T5 presents a lot of that. It's not a complex system, but it is rife with crunch, and that is something that some gamers find daunting, if not off-putting. The initial release of Traveller 5 was, to be blunt, badly put together. Perhaps Mark Benner attempted to cram too much into a single volume. Perhaps whatever editors or proofreaders he had on board, if any, were not wholly up to the task to handle such a dense work. Regardless, the systems and ideas within that single tome achieved at least part of the incredible mission statement to set out the ultimate edition of the Traveller system. It may not have been pretty, it may have needed a ton of errata, but it did cover virtually everything. The 3-volume 5.1 edition, on the other hand, is that ultimate edition. True, if you are used to glossy art and explanatory text of a more prose than technical base, even these may be a mountain that does not look appealing enough to climb. But for those of us that were raised on rulebooks that were often typed rather than typeset, that had art only so far as the authors could muster, and what went to more of crunch than window dressing within the pages of content afforded to them, this set is almost perfect. With the inclusion of copious build examples, weapons and armour in particular, and the expansion into the 3-volume format to neatly subdivide the rules into a more manageable reading form, it is the ultimate toolkit, representing the Traveller evolution of rules. That is, if you see Traveller as a rule system per se. You see, one thing I have noticed over the years is that Traveller, once a generic science fiction role-playing game with a hand-waved background to give an example of context to the rules, has conceptually grown to be synonymous with the Third Imperium as a setting. Almost to the point where Traveller and the Imperium are not separate, but conjoined. This is especially visible in its second edition on, certainly present within Mongoose Traveller, and absolutely present within the Interregnum licensed versions that were essentially porting the setting to different rules. While the core background to the Imperium and charted space is present within the T5 books, it feels to me at least like a return to its use within the days of classic Traveller. That charted space is an example of the implementation, not the total of the implementation. Perhaps that lack of source material within the rulebooks, other than a handful of pages and mentions, is where I get a sense of that from. Whatever its origin, that feeling of Traveller being a preeminent science fiction game of many possibilities hits me every time I reference its books. I suppose the greatest aspect of T5 is that it is a toolkit with many, many spanners. This gives a referee a lot of options to work with to fine-tune the rules and the content of a campaign to the needs of his or her gaming group. That is a good thing, but it goes beyond that too. If you're a player of pretty much any other edition of Traveller, you will find something in T5 that can enhance your experience with that edition. In particular, if you are playing classic Mega Traveller T4 or Mongoose, the statistics, while not precisely cross-compatible, are close enough to be able to use materials from any of those with T5 or any of T5's subsystems to enhance play using those other editions. In this way, I like to think of T5 as Advanced Traveller, the ultimate toolbox and set of enhancements for the game, while Mongoose Traveller can be seen as current-day Basic Traveller. On the downside, unless you are used to technical manuals, T5's rules are a hard read. Everything that you need is there, it's just not always in the place that you'd expect to find it, although the places where things can be found does follow an internal logic. The books are indexed, which is an absolute plus and an essential that was missing from the initial volume, but often index entries are not as useful as they could have been. Looking up a particular subject will give you a string of pages where that subject is mentioned, but doesn't identify which of those actually defines it. Made worse by the fact that some concepts are mentioned before they are defined, so not even the go for the lowest page number rule of thumb is always useful. The language form the book is written in occasionally requires multiple reads before a particular element can be grasped. At first read, Especially with the original volume, I found myself silently yelling, "But how do I do this?" more than once before the penny dropped, usually because I'd skipped over or hadn't got to a key concept definition that proved to be a missing piece of the jigsaw being tackled. If T5 had current Mongoose formatting, it would have been an easier read. However, I hate to think how many volumes T5 would have required had it adopted the level of art and layout spacing used by the current Mongoose editions. 3 volumes wouldn't even have scratched the surface. So on the plus side, we have a complete toolkit of a system that has your back when it comes to virtually any science fiction setting that you could imagine, that is crunchy with some nice touches of pseudo-realism baked in. On the downside, it's not the easiest of works to reference and would likely make a newcomer to the Traveller game's head explode. The game just has the one essential, because there isn't all that much of it out there, and that is the 3-volume Traveller 5.1 set. Seriously, do not bother with the 5.0 rulebook, the single volume. It's a nice to have reminder for those of us that have quietly kept Traveller close to our hearts for so long, but it is little use as an actual game system. The 5.1 set is where it's at, and with a little applied gear-headedness, it can be a joy to run. The second survey book is not essential, but if you're running a campaign in charted space, it is a nice to have work, unless you have a tablet or laptop at the table running Traveller Map instead. While Traveller the New Era remains my favourite edition of Traveller, T5 comes a close second, perhaps because I am a gearhead that likes to build and create with my RPG hobbying. That Mark Miller has signed both of my T5 sets with warm messages simply makes these volumes all the more cherished. Traveller 5th edition, aka T5, espoused to be the ultimate edition of the Traveller game. I believe it achieves that, but in doing so it makes itself somewhat inaccessible to casual, light and new players of the game. You cannot pick up T5 as your introduction to Traveller and hope to make any sense out of it, but you can achieve a gratifying gaming experience from it if you are willing to put in the effort to understanding it. For me, it is something that I feel every Traveller player should have in their shelves, if only to seek answers to odd questions their likely simpler favoured edition of the game doesn't answer for itself. And that rounds out our exploration into the history of the Traveller game. Across this particular slice of this series, we have journeyed from the classic edition of 1977 to the updated second Mongoose edition of 2022 and so on. Traveller is one of the major foundations of the role-playing game hobby, and rightly deserves the praise and accolades that it has garnered over time. Arguably, games such as Battletech and Shadowrun would not exist if not for Traveller and GDW's early licensing policies, and certainly games that use life path systems must owe some debt to the game. As viewers of my channel can attest, I make no bones about Traveller being my first, and still my favourite, role-playing game. As this is likely the last of my videos for 2023, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone that has joined me here in examining all sorts of corners of the great RPG hobby. Thank you for subscribing, commenting, participating, and above all, putting up with my rambles and my music. I'm wishing you all of the best for 2024. Take care.